Hej och välkommen till FRpodden. In this episode I talk with Allan Nygaard, Nordic Regional Director at Talentsoft. We talk about employee satisfaction and company leadership. We also spend some time on how companies should work with upskilling and reskilling of employees. And we also cover the fact that the pandemic has indirectly made our employees more autonomous. I really want to reach out with a huge thank you to Allan for taking his time, his very busy schedule, and to joining me in this conversation. And without further ado, I give you Allan Nygaard.
Allan, welcome to the podcast. It's so nice to have you here.
Thank you, Carl. I've been looking forward to join this podcast.
Nice. So, Allan Nygaard, you're from Talentsoft. That's right.
I am from Talentsoft. That's correct. I've been around not since 2007 when the company was founded, but since 2015, where I started up the office in the Nordic region, counting Copenhagen, Stockholm, and Oslo.
Okay.
And prior to that, I worked in the recruitment industry. I have a background in sociology. And a fun fact is that I was amongst the two first people hired on the ground in the Nordic region.
All
and
right.
Now we count 35 highly skilled people.
That sounds great. Can you tell us a little more about Talentsoft? What type of company is it? What do you do?
Well, what do we do? We focus on HR software, or also known as HRIS, and the ability of transforming your workforce, varying from a typical ATS or applicant tracking system to performance reviews, to people calibration, to learning as a topic, to compensation and benefits, to analytics, and everything is tied together into what we call the hub, which is our master data offering. Because what we've seen for a long time, that in the Nordic, the master data part is the driving part in
Yes.
companies' processes of digitizing HR data. They start out with HR core data.
All right. So your product, is it sort of a collection of all these different things that you use in the recruitment, the ATS, the like personality tests, or like the whole profiling of a candidate?
That would be fully included in the recruitment module, but the seamlessly integrated HRIS suite also contains a performance review module, a talent review module, so a complete HR process tool going from cradle to grave.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning going from sourcing of candidates to hiring or recruiting candidates to onboarding to performance to talent review. We are here to accelerate people's careers and to combine aspirations with opportunities, meaning every single employee as of today has aspirations, looking for potentially a different or at least a slightly different job in the organization. And the organization is a kind of a machinery producing opportunities, conquering new markets, opening new business entities. And with Talentsoft or any other HRIS, I should add, or at least the good HRISs, you as a company should be able to place your competencies or your employees where they make the most value and where they excel the most, where they feel comfortable, and where they reskill and upskill their potential.
Are you working with all types of clients, both smaller or bigger? It sounds like it's more for big companies in my ears.
It could be perceived that way, Carl. I agree, but out of the 2,500 customers of Talentsoft, roughly a third of them are below 1,000 employees. So it depends on what we perceive or characterize as small, medium, or enterprise. Then another third is between 1 and 5,000 employees. And the remaining third is exceeding 5,000 employees and characterized as enterprise. So a great prospect there. I need to add
Interesting.
also to your question that we've been fairly successful in Denmark when it comes to the finance vertical or the finance segment. And why is that? We seem to have had a quite good track record with finance in Denmark, going from Sydbank, a fairly large bank in Denmark, to Jyske Bank, probably a well-known name to some of the Swedish listeners, to Nykredit, also one of the large banks in Denmark. And don't hesitate to reach out if we should further elaborate on why we've been so successful in Denmark.
But Allan, before we get into today's talking points, I'd like you to, just in general, who is Allan?
That's a good question. I go to work every day in Copenhagen, Stockholm, or Oslo, and I'm only fulfilled and fully satisfied when I have clients who feel almost the same. I'm in my mid-40s. I exercise and run a lot to cope with my surroundings and my colleagues and my family. I'm well known as a go-getter. I never give up. I want to find solutions. I think my many years at university studying sociology gave me a natural interest into how organizations work. What makes your day going to work? I want to be on top of how my own organization are performing as a leader, as a regional director, to make sure the people that is on my payroll are not only delivering, having a good day, having a good job, having a good life. Lately, and that's maybe the last 10, 15, 20 years, we do also see tendencies here and there that private life kind of melts together with your professional life, which is sometimes a good thing and sometimes it's not a good thing. I think there's a reason
Exactly.
why a lot of younger generations are reported ill with stress sometimes. And I think that's a key topic for a manager or a leader to be aware of, that now it's 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. or whatever, and I don't expect you to answer emails during the evening. Lately, a new law was implemented in France, or it's a year ago, that as a manager, you are not allowed to email your employees after 7 p.m.
Interesting, because it's very good that you're getting into this topic of how you're actually managing your staff, because the reason we're on this call is that you made a survey a couple of weeks ago talking about leadership and how employees perceive leadership in their organizations now, well, during, after the pandemic. Can you tell us a little about your key findings there?
Definitely, it was I would say, some very interesting findings. Indeed, just a bit of background. We asked Swedish employees about how they have perceived the leadership during the pandemic. So in the early stages of the pandemic, when everything went ballistic, and also at let's say the end of the pandemic, if it has ended, no one knows. But the interesting part here is that we were also able to compare our findings to a survey we did just before the pandemic. So I think we carried out a strong scientific methodology here with a lot of findings. But one less positive thing about the survey is that the survey showed that 12 out of 16, can you imagine, 12 out of 16 important managerial qualities are or were perceived to have deteriorated during the pandemic, or they
Yes.
became worse, which is challenging. But the one who had deteriorated the most was creating community and cohesion in the team, is what has become most difficult. And it makes so much sense. One would argue that in a pandemic where you have remote work, everyone's working from home, being fully booked with Teams or Zoom meetings, back-to-back meetings, because no one seemed to recognize or acknowledge that you need 5, 10, 15 minutes in between meetings for a bio break or just take a walk or fresh air. So it's interesting, but it's not that big a surprise that being able to create a community or sense of community and cohesion in the team was one of the qualities that leaders struggle the most with.
Why do you think that it was difficult for the managers to cope with this situation, like to this whole world of remote working? Why was this difficult for the managers? Did you spend any thought on that?
Partly, and from some of the clients that I have regular chats with about this topic, when being at the office regularly, you may do formalized meetings in the mornings and the afternoons, but your everyday life at the office, where you familiarize with your employees and your employees familiarize with their managers, when picking up a coffee, when going to the canteen or the nearby restaurant to pick up a meal, when meeting up early in the morning prior to office work to do a run in the nearby park, to have an afternoon drink on Thursdays, maybe also on Fridays at 4 or 5 p.m., just to absorb the impressions of the day. So going to the office is kind of a knitwear
Yeah.
where everyone feels part of a bigger group or community, and then that creates cohesion. But when everyone sits behind their screen and they're hooked up in different meetings, and you never have that small check-in time with your manager or your co-workers at the coffee machine, at the bar, at the restaurant nearby, you lose out. You sit back at home in isolation, and you don't sense your manager because he or she is not around. On Teams regularly, but it becomes so distant somehow. So I think that's the main reason why.
Yeah. Another thing that you found out in your survey was that the employees were very unsure about how their managers perceived their work from home, like what they were doing when they were working, that they were being contacted outside of what they would conceive as their office hours. You sort of lost this, as you talk about cohesion, by not being together. A fun fact was that we also did a survey from my company, Finance Recruitment, before summer about the, like we called it, the new way of working. And one of the key things there was that a lot of respondents, this was done amongst like leaders and HR specialists, that companies expect their employees to use more self-leadership and to actually be more proactively involved in the organization, like taking their own initiative to be independent in their work. Is this something that you have experienced from where you're working or from in Denmark in general?
Definitely, because when not being at the office, no one will take your hand and guide you and tell you you need to be part of this and this project. And this is why the managerial role has become even more important during the pandemic, because there is a risk of losing out on key staff members that needs that guidance, or some employees wants more guidance. And a manager clearly describing, now you need to check into this project. But when sitting at home, you just fulfill your obligation, what you're already involved in. But some people also get bored with that. Hence, they start reaching out to people internally in our global company saying, hey, I have spare time. Shouldn't I support you with building that new project that I heard you were building? So I've also seen quite a few team members elevating their presence internally by reaching out to people that they did not have project going on with. And why did they do that? Because we also gave them a lot of freedom. That's one of the other findings of the surveys. A result of the pandemic was that we indirectly made our employees autonomous. We hired you. You are senior guys. You can work from home. So that's one of the findings. One other interesting reflection on the pandemic is that a key part of our delivery is delivering HIS platforms. And that can be a 2-month project or a 12-month project. Prior to the pandemic, we were doing on-site meetings and on-site implementations 2 to 3 times a week at one specific client, doing workshops and trainings and user acceptance tests and design configuration, all of that were transferred into a remote context by the time the pandemic had started. And we all thought that this is going to be really, really challenging, doing classroom training and listening in and consolidating the needs of 10, 15 people in a Teams meeting. But it worked out, and it still works out.
I would like to take us back a step to something that you talked about just recently, that colleagues or co-workers who get free times, like that they are more efficient from home, and then they free up time and actually proactively reach into the organization to offer their assistance. Is this something that you experienced within your company?
I would say yes, definitely.
And what do you think is the driving factor behind that, like a company cultural thing that you would actually think of, hey, I want to contribute more because I can, rather than one could imagine sitting at home doing your work and then thinking, I'm more efficient, I have more free time to do something else? Do you see them interwoven, like your culture in your company and the fact that people have been using this opportunity to proactively offer up their help to colleagues who have more to do?
I think it may be a direct result of a crisis mode. Out of the pandemic grew a significant need for digital support for HR processes. But the fact that a lot of people were working from home, I also clearly believe that gave them time to reflect. Being out of their usual environment, getting into the office in the morning, attaching your laptop to the desk, picking up your coffee. We all know that the change fosters new ideas and potentially revolutions, meaning that once you need to cope with a new situation, some people find that hard, others excel in such a new environment and find solutions to things that they have been thinking carefully about for decades. And clearly, some had a good time working from home, others had a struggle here and there. But I think we experienced a common sense of, I'm not going to call it crisis, but alertness. So some of the strong project managers that I have in the team who are experts in one specific HR process, they started reaching out to the developer team saying, hey, we found a few inconsistencies. We need cohesion from this process to this process. Why don't we brainstorm and put on paper a wiser way of carrying out that process in the tool? And that has been the result. And we would not have done that to the same extent 2 years ago with more, don't quote me on this, difficult when it's a podcast, but no silos. I mean, we've definitely fostered team collaboration and people stepping into other people's teams, or stepping in is such a harsh way of expressing it, but everyone making themselves available. If you know that your next door colleague is struggling with preparing whatever that is, if you reach out and help him or her, there's a pretty good chance that he or she will reach out to you next week when you're just as busy.
I think it sounds wonderful that you've been able to foster that type of culture in your company. How do you work with the company culture in Talentsoft? Like, do you do something to proactively foster this mentality of thinking, or did it just come up during the pandemic? What do you think?
It's been present since the early days of Talentsoft. We were founded by 3 very visionary French tech guys, or HR tech guys, and starting that out in 2007 with a very visionary mindset around one should practice the HR discipline. That led to Talentsoft having a very open, transparent, supporting, collaborative culture where we act as a unified team. Lately, also during the pandemic, we carried out a large internal culture project in interviewing employees, managers, people with seniority, people without seniority, and we simply asked them, I mean, what's at stake here? Why do you like working here? A simple message as such grew out of that. Like, team conversation is our currency. It needs to be a pleasant experience for Talentsofties to go to work and be bold, try out new things. Maybe not in front of a new customer, but try it out internally and see if it works. Be courageous. So it really tied the people closely or strongly to the company.
Okay. On the topic of how you have done your company, how are you looking forward from this? I mean, we have been sort of mentioning this during and after the pandemic. Now we don't know if it's over, but how are you going to move forward? Do you have any, have you seen any, like, I don't, to use a big word, paradigm shift or bigger changes that you think are prevalent now within the HR tech market or how you do business? What will change going forward? What is the new standard?
Yeah, a few. I mean, it's a fact that hybrid work is now here for good. Prior to the pandemic, we were talking about gig economy and freelancers and young millennials working 2 days a week at home for employer A and then 3 days a week on site for employer B. So hybrid work is definitely here to stay. Companies are now faced definitely with the challenge of making employees satisfied with the right mix of remote work and office work. You cannot do 100% remote, and in the past you could do 100% office work, but finding the right combination per individual and apply that in teams so that we focus on delivering and contributing. And lastly, what became very clear during the pandemic, I mean, the upskilling and the reskilling of employees. Because right now in many businesses, including finance, we see a huge need of, let's call it, senior professionals with the right skills. And in many companies, you would per default choose the option of hiring new people. Try to convince your competitors' employees to work for you. But we've seen a clear trend that it's becoming more and more obvious and more apparent that you could also focus on upskilling and reskilling your employees. And why? Because you have a lot of assets walking around at the office. The cost of upskilling and reskilling these employees are far, far less than going out into the market, hiring new people. It will take 6 to 9 to 12 months until they're fully onboarded, until they're fully autonomous, until they can really start producing. So upskilling and reskilling your current employees is also a perfect way of showcasing that you care, that you have a strong employer brand. And with the right attention and the right upskilling and reskilling, you can find so many different or slightly different positions inside the company.
What do you think is the biggest hurdle for companies to get to do this? Of course, you want to retain the employees that you like working with and that enjoys working at your company. But what is it that the companies require in order to enable the upskilling of their employees? I understand funds, but in the mindset of how to go from one to the other, do you think that a lot of companies are there, or is still a journey to get there?
Yes, absolutely. This is about combining the overall strategic vision of the company, or let's say the objectives of the company, with the people strategy. Meaning, it may sound simple, it's not. Companies need to focus on identifying the skills gap and then at the same time prepare themselves on which skills will be the most valuable in the future. Is that mathematics? Is it robotics? Is it language skills? Is it what kind of skills? So that's the starting point. But then you also need to map and identify which skills the current employees possess. So you need to know your fundament. You need to know the starting point. It's a fact, and other surveys tell that a lot of companies believe that they experience a skills gap. But how can they experience that if they haven't fully mapped all the skills and competencies of their current workforce.
Is that something you do with your tool, for example?
I'm glad you asked, Carl. Definitely, that's one out of the many interesting parts I can help reveal. The tool operates with what we call a job library. So for every specific job in a company, there are competencies and skills attached to that job. So if you apply for such a job, your competencies and skills needs to, map to at least 90% accuracy the skills and competencies required in that specific job.
Exactly.
But once we've mapped your skills and competencies and we know your aspirations, it's going to be way lot easier for us to combine your skills and competencies with the open positions that we also have in the job library. So the tool can simply compare your skills and competencies with the skills and competencies required for such a job. And then if we simply know that you want to move to Malmö to start a new office, we would be able to tell with quite some predictability and accuracy whether or not that would be a successful move. And you would be happy because we would be listening into your requirements. You would stay in the company and you would speak highly about the company at the same time.
Okay. Like enabling people to more easily continue their careers within companies.
Absolutely.
Basically.
And should it be the case that we've studied and investigated whether or not you should make a job change within the company, and we find out that right now what you want is simply not something we can accommodate, then you would feel acknowledged. We made an effort. And you would maybe need to leave the company for a while, but you would have high thoughts and great memories of having worked for us. Meaning, if another job opening would pop up in 3 to 5 years, you would strongly consider to return back home into a maybe more managerial role or slightly different role. So it's all about employer branding also.
Allan, I want to be mindful of our time. So I would like to ask you a question that I ask all my guests that I'm very fond of. If somebody were to listen into this podcast and hear about you and what you're doing at Talentsoft and the way you're approaching business and think, that sounds really cool, I want to be more like Allan, what would your tips be to this person? Like, what are your advice to someone who wants to do the same thing as you?
Be humble and curious, and never think you have the right answer. Always hire people that are smarter than yourself, and never stop learning. I mean, keep reading books, keep at least trying to plan to learn a new language. Try to understand before being understood.
Thank you. Those are some good advice. Allan, I would like to thank you so much for taking your time to talk with me today. And it's been very interesting hearing about you, hearing about Talentsoft, and our discussion about talent management and what has actually been going on for the last year with leadership and motivation within the companies. Thank you so much, and I wish you a continued great day.
Thank you also, Carl. It's been a pleasure joining the podcast.